Let me ask you a question. What do you do for a living? I sometimes get this question and I don't always know how to answer it, so I've learned over time to counter it with another question. I'll ask people like, when was the last time you saw a new music instrument? And people think and deliberate and most commonly conclude that they don't know. And for good reason, because the reality is, in mainstream eyes and ears, it's still pianos and guitars and keyboards and drums and basses and vocals and all that. But it's the usual suspects, right? Occasional car passing by as well. So for me, I say, the last invention that was truly formed music in a new way was the computer. It was the DAW. And I thought it could be cool today to sit here in the rainy Napa Valley on this beautiful spring day. It's so rare we have rain up here, by the way, so when we have it, it's kind of unique. And I thought it could be cool to shoot outside because today it's all about DAW. It's all about the digital audio workstation. We gotta find a better word for that, by the way. DAW sounds like. The same thing with workstation. Workstation, like you're just in front of the bench just hammering your nails, right? It's a bad term as well. Let's find a new term for it, but we're gonna call it the dawn of the DAW today, while it's windy here as hell. The DAW, for me, my whole thing started when I was about 6 years old in the early 80s. I started with the ZX Spectrum 48 kilobytes, a beautiful computer by Lord Sinclair from the United Kingdom, and an awesome computer. And I remember fondly what it looked like. It was this black thing. It had these, I think, rainbow colors on it. And it had, the keys were like kind of rubbery, almost like you can, if you had an eraser and a pencil, you could almost use the keys as erasers. At least we made that joke back then. But it was an awesome tool. I think the first computer music I was exposed to was in the Hall of the Mountain King by Edvard Grieg, the Norwegian composer. And I remember playing Manic Miner, and it sounded like this. And then around like 1983, the Commodore 64 happened. I migrated from the Spectrum 48 kilobytes to the Commodore 64 that had a mighty 64 kilobytes. And I remember it had this keyboard that you could overlay on, so you can actually play things on it while you're overlaying. It's pretty cool. Like it was almost like a little like MIDI piano before MIDI. It had this awesome program called Drum Studio where you could do like primitive beats, but I thought it was so cool. So a part of my first sort of interaction with the computer back then, and I must have been like 7 or 8 years old, but was to use Drum Studio and make like super cool beats. So back then I remember like I got my vinyl records, like for example Herbie Hancock's Rocket, which is really like one of the most substantially influencing track of my time. But you'd go and look at the back cover of it and it would talk about like, the Fairlight or the Mirage or the Prophet 5 or the ARP 2600, stuff like that. Like things I can only dream of, but I was stuck on the little Commodore 64. And one of my fondest memories of the C64 was actually that it had the ability to resample. It was super primitive and you couldn't do a lot with it, but just that notion that you could sample something was like mind-blowing. Like in this example here, this is basic sampling of Ella Fitzgerald, and you can only sample this little proportion here, and you used almighty 62 kilobytes of the computer. You still need to reserve 2 kilobytes left for it, but that was all it could do. But it was kind of cool. And to play this one sample, I actually used 20% of the computer resources in the C64. So it just gives you an idea about how humble it was back then when it comes to resources. And then sometime around 1987, I want to say, I got the Amiga 512 that had 512 kilobytes. So remember, we went from the Commodore 64 with 64 to a mighty 512. And I have to yell right now because the wind and hail or whatever it is hitting my face, but it's beautiful. So that was a big jump. The Amiga 512 for me was one of the biggest jumps. I remember one of the first soundtracks I ever heard on it, which really stayed with me, was Defender of the Crown. It was this beautiful game that sort of had a Robin Hoodish kind of atmosphere to it, where you're supposed to conquer like Britain. In fact, the first video game I ever got to score was Defender of the Crown for the PlayStation 2. That was a great honor for me because this game was probably one of the most important games of my life, and the soundtrack was so memorable. So it was the greatest honor to get to rescore that, and it's still one of my super fond memories of going back. And the Amiga 512 was a substantial move ahead, both in terms of its computational power, more RAM and all that, but also in terms of software. I remember the first software used was called Eggox Onyx. It was this super primitive, like white screen sequencer where you could sort of dot in the notes and do very, very basic notation, but you can actually use tiny small samples, and you had basic resampling capabilities in the Amiga. It actually had sampling software, so you could take small bits and pieces and put them together. They also had this other program called ProTracker, one of the first really great trackers, this 4-channel tracker where you can use samples inside of it. They're really phenomenal scores for the Amiga. Like for me, that was one of the first things that turned me on to soundtracks. Besides Miami Vice, by the way, Jan Hammer's like theme for Miami Vice like was mind blowing. That stays with me. But the great Gianna sisters for the Amiga, I remember that. Like it was so cool. Actually, in our Majestica library, our 240-piece Majestica orchestra, I used the same melodic fragment as the Gianna sisters because that theme just always stayed with me. Like really, really cool. But then also something else happened. We started getting to the day and age of MIDI. I used the sequencer on the Amiga called Dr. T, this really, really basic sequencer, but it was super cool and I had a lot of fun with it. And I connected it to my first module ever, which was the Roland MT32. And the Roland MT32 was a masterpiece in my opinion. It was one of the first multi-temporal modules. I think you could do up to 8 or 16 channels on it. And there are specific patches that became sample gold and we saw derivatives of later in time. I remember 2 presets in particular, one called Soundtrack and the other one called Ice Rain. Let me just show you here what they sound like. They're absolutely gorgeous patches and I think you'll understand when I say like you probably heard them before. You know, it's funny when you live in Northern California. I used to live in Denmark. I would like run in the snow in t-shirts and now like I'm so frail, like I get cold even on this kind of warm spring day. Like it's not working out. One of the issues with the MT32, a little bit in the same sense with the abundance of rain right now, is that you had so many tools. Like I've never had like multi-temporal capabilities before. So there was like Ice Rain and Soundtrack on everything I did and it was so overly colored. And it's something we should probably talk about in the future as well. Because with the infinite amount of resources and sample libraries today, I think we sometimes forget what it's about. The simplicity. Go back, listen to the In the Air with Phil Collins. It's a Prophet 5 patch and a couple of other things and that's it. And it totally works, right? Whereas like with some of the shit I do, like there's so many colors and so many advanced things because I can. A little like in the beginning, like when surround sound came out, right? Like it was like surround all over and all that, and the sounds were like, it was just too much. We've learned to temper it over time. We learned to temper the music. We need to learn to temper the samples as well, particularly in this day and age with like these massive sample catalogs that I'm a little bit guilty of as well. But anyway, that was the Roland MT32. And then I migrated to another Roland device, which is this rack module as well, called the JEW110. And I want to say Eric Persing probably had a finger or two in that one. It has a little bit of that early Spectrasonic sound to it. An awesome unit with beautiful samples. And this was more in the sort of multi-sampled realm. Things were starting to get a little more advanced now. This is like true PCM sampling. And that unit for me was mind-blowing as well. Like the piano was like super real. And when you hear them today, it was like, no. But back then it was like virtual reality for the ear. There's nothing greater than that. One of the demos I really recall truly. Let me just show it to you right here. It's just a great demo and just one of those 80s, late 80s things. It's fucking awesome. Or 2 years later, I want to say this is around 1989 or 1990, I got the Korg M1, the best-selling synthesizer of all time. Who doesn't remember the Universe patch? Like, to me, the M1 had the best demos I've ever heard. I actually ended up putting them on my mixtape. I had like Jan Hammer's Miami Vice, I had Herb Hancock's Rocket, and then I had the Korg M1 demos all playing side by side. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Like the saxophone in this particular demo here, like let me just play it for you, because it, like, that was for me, like, you know, we talk about advanced legato sampling and that. I was like, this is a saxophone, it's totally real. It's funny, you know, when you look at old CG in movies as well, like how we become better over time at like, no, this doesn't look real anymore. When you watch The Lawnmower Man, it's like laughable, but back then it was like so cool, right? The same thing with the M1, the same thing with samples, and arguably we're probably gonna listen to our samples the same way one day. It was like, this is not real at all. But that's the progression of technology, right? And then 1992 happened, and for me that was one of the biggest like leaps. We went into the ASR10 by Ensoniq, the advanced sample recorder. This was a 2 megabyte sampling keyboard like Kanye West has used on a lot of his albums, and the sequencer inside of that unit is very particular and still used in hip-hop to this day and age because it has a specific way of quantizing the sound. I think it was like a 12-bit resampling synthesizer, and it just had like an amazing sound to it. It was nothing like you hear today. There was a warmth in that particular unit. I love the ASR10. I actually expanded mine. I think you could expand it up to 16 megabytes. I could only afford 10, but that was mind-blowing. I remember like sampling like little snippets from Alan Silvestri's like the Abyss soundtrack, and then used like Bonham's like beautiful drum beat on top and mixing them and all that. That was so cool back then. Like the ASR10 and Ensoniq was really one of the true things because they made mainstream able to afford samplers, you know? And for me that was like almost back to like the Mirage or the Fairlight days where you like nobody could have, like I couldn't afford it, but this ASR10 was one of those few things that was sort of, okay, we're down at like a lower level now, mainstream can start using this device. I'm so sad Ensoniq is not around anymore because I think they did a great contribution to the mainstream movement of digital music. Really, really a beautiful, beautiful sampler, like unlike anything, and it still sounds good to this day. Like there's a lot of modern albums that's still running through the ASR10. Gorgeous device. And then things sort of became mundane. I think around 1996, it was the year my mom died. I got from some of the money I inherited from her, I bought the Kurzweil K2500, which was expandable, I think up to like 128 mix. I think I had 32 in mine. And that was crazy because now you could start loading sample libraries. These are the early days of the Akai sample libraries, the 1000 units and all that. Like really, really unique samples and sample libraries, and we saw the early days of it. Like Persing was doing the Roland sample libraries, like really, really cool stuff. The true dawn and age of what I would say sort of the new sampling, and it wasn't quite deep sampling where we are today, but it was between the early days of multi-samples and into like real sampling with compact discs and later DVDs and all that stuff. It's funny, I thought about the other day, like I'm recording this in 4K, right? If you look at the rate of 4K, it's like 1 minute could fit on an entire compact disc. Like it's that crazy to shoot in 4K actually. So I hope you enjoy all my finite details. But then the PC happened, and I'll spare you of all the different PCs I've gone through, but I started with this is like a 486 66 megahertz, and then I went to a Pentium 1, then it was an AMD 200, AMD 400, AMD 800, and then, you know, things just got crazy. And in about 2005, I had 9 PCs. These were dual or quad cores, and every 2 PCs were designated to a part of the orchestra. So I had 2 for brass, 2 for woodwinds, 2 for strings and all that stuff. And it was a massive setup. I remember coming to the United States when I moved over here. I actually got stopped in customs because I had these bags with hard drives. I had like 40 hard drives because I didn't want to ship them. And I got stopped for bomb control, and I'd lost my plane and all that stuff because, like, you know, nobody carries like 40 hard drives. It looked like the ultimate like crazy device. And now we're here. the good year of 2018, I'm down to one PC. It's a 110 gigahertz, 32 core PC with 512 gigabytes of RAM and 20 terabytes of solid state drives and 2 octa-core UID cards. And that's where it stops. And for me, it ties a little bit back to what I said with the MT32. Obviously, it's super cool. I need it because we're developing sample libraries and I love testing all the mics and all that at the same time. But when you listen to my crazy demos and other people as well, like, because we've gotten so many colors, so many tools, we've almost got a little lost in transition or translation or whatever you call it, because there's too much available. So let's start a dialogue as well about going a little bit back to simplicity. Let's scale a little bit down. How come the best tracks, when you look at them, often is like 8 or 10 tracks just stacked the right way with the right emotion, all that stuff. Sample goal as well. Like, you don't need that much sample goal to do something that's beautiful. So I just wanted to appreciate the dawn of the DAW and its all beauty and complexity and all that stuff. Like, I want to hear what you guys are doing as well. You know, I started like early 80s. I'm sure some of you guys go way back. I'm sure some of you guys start a little later, but share what you went through. I want to hear your trials and tribulations when it comes to technology. But let's also get this conversation rolling about the beautiful thing about simplicity. Maybe it's just a voice sometimes talking. It doesn't always have to be so super complicated. So yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit about my past and my musical upbringing, and there's a lot of people that have an enormous impact on me. But you know, I can ramble about this stuff all day long. I love the nostalgic factor in it. I think it's super hilarious to listen to some of the old stuff. I think there's so much to be learned from it. I tend to forget things too fast in this day and age of technology, and I just want to go a little bit back to that sort of reappreciation of the past as well. So forgive me for rambling a little bit. As I said in the last vlog, I'm in my life's biggest crunch right now. You probably see it on the lines on my eyes in beautiful 4K, but just, you know, the past, it's beautiful. The future might be even better, I hope.